As Pam said, my name is Josh Tompkins. I am an invasive carp coordinator here in Western Kentucky. Today I'm going to be giving an overview of our invasive carp management approach for Kentucky, with specific focus on here in Western Kentucky, Barkley, Kentucky reservoirs and the lower Tennessee Cumberland rivers, as well as tying into how Kentucky is working at a sub-basin level and a national level with partners to work in the invasive carp management field. So just a quick introduction about how we got to where we are in Kentucky with invasive carp. The bighead and silver carp were introduced into the U.S. in the early 1970s for fish farming in the lower Mississippi River Basin. Subsequently, they were introduced into the wild by the 1980s and pretty well established in the lower Mississippi River. It took about 10 years for them to migrate upstream and have their first reports in the lower Ohio, and then about another 10 years before we received our first reports of bighead and silver carp in Barkley and Kentucky reservoirs. So invasive carp are a problem throughout the Mississippi River Basin, which, as you can see here, is a pretty extensive part of the U.S. And so the way that we break up managing invasive carp is through sub-basin partnerships. As you see here, each sub-basin is a different color, and as you can see, several of the states actually span across multiple sub-basins. So here in Kentucky, we are actually within 3 sub-basins: the Tennessee Cumberland, the Ohio River, and the lower Mississippi River. The way that invasive carp are managed nationally is through the Mississippi Interstate Cooperative Resource Association. And what this MICRA for short does is it is a partnership of 28 states and federal partners such as USGS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and tribal agencies, as well as several other agencies. And what they do and are tasked with doing is managing interjurisdictional fisheries resources. So within MICRA, this other organization called the Invasive Carp Advisory Committee has been established to help drive and make recommendations for invasive carp management throughout the Mississippi River Basin. Now within the ICAC, several working groups have been established, such as this one here, the Sampling Approach Work Group, that has been tasked with developing protocols to inform invasive carp management and control efforts and provide technical assistance to partners within subbasins. There are also other working groups that are tasked with the data analysis and data management side of invasive carp management, as well as coordinating and disseminating information about control actions as they are applied across the landscape. So a lot of different things go into developing the recommendations from these work groups, and as you can see here, a lot of times you end up in a room with a really messy whiteboard meeting before you have good products that come out of these. So what are we doing in Kentucky for invasive carp management? Well, our overarching goal is to reduce the abundance and distribution of invasive carp in Kentucky. And we approach those goals through control and containment actions that I will talk to you about here shortly. One of the interesting things that we've done as a control action here in Kentucky is that we have got behind recreational harvest of invasive carp. So in 2018, Kentucky and Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency got together and co-hosted a bow fishing tournament here in Western Kentucky that was aimed at invasive carp specifically. And so that brought a lot of national attention to the area, as well as now we have a lot of tourism that is directed specifically towards bow fishing for invasive carp here in Western Kentucky. In 2020, the the Wildlife Commission passed regulation allowing for the sale of invasive carp with just a recreational fishing license. So this helped encourage the proper disposal of those fish that they were coming in and harvesting, as opposed to ending up in landfills or just on the banks. So they had an avenue to dispose of them and make a little money. Since 2020, bow fishers here in western Kentucky have sold or donated over 200,000 pounds of invasive carp annually to processors here in this portion of the state. Another component is some outreach that we do with local outdoor groups, hunting and fishing shows, where we go and we talk about the excellent table fare that bighead and silver carp are. Both these bighead and silver carp have a very mild flavor fillet, and they're really high in nutritional value as well. However, they are a little more bony than most of our native species, such as largemouth bass or crappie. So during our outreach events, we typically bring some fish that we demonstrate how to fillet and how to prepare the fillets for cooking, and a couple of different preparation methods for that. Our staff particularly like to take a fillet and smoke them for these events. Then they take that smoked fillet and either turn it into a smoked carp dip and pair it with crackers, or do just a flaked smoked carp and pair it with pico de gallo and corn chips. We've had really good feedback about this, just kind of illustrating these fish as a really good source of protein and not a trash fish. Part of our containment approach here in Kentucky has been to partner with federal agencies to install the bioacoustic fish fence at the downstream approach of Barkley Lock. So what this is a system that is embedded in the river channel that has sound projectors and produces bubble curtains and has lights. And so the way it appears at nighttime is like an underwater disco right there on the downstream approach. But the way that the bubble curtain and sounds in particular break up the water, the silver and bighead perceive that, because of their inner ear, very sensitive hearing, as more of a physical structure. And you can kind of see here in this picture, this is the downstream side of that approach, and you can see a little bit in this lighting, but there's a darker hue to that water because of all the fish that are right up to that bubble curtain line, and then on the upstream side of it, we don't see nearly as many fish. So the system went into a research phase in 2019, and we did a research period from 2019 to 2023. In 24, that system went to a continuous on period. Results from this research indicate that this non-physical deterrent limits upstream passage of silver carp by 50%. This system, we are currently working with our partners in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers as a non-federal sponsor to transfer it from the Fish and Wildlife Service over to the Corps of Engineers for long-term use. This is being directed through some federal legislation called the Water Resource Development Act. It also, in this act, it calls out for at least 2 more of these type of deterrents to be installed with the Tennessee, Cumberland, and the Tombigbee waterways. One of those for sure has to be on the Tombigbee, so we've gone through a process of looking at where the most likely spots for these other 2 deterrents could be implemented. One of those I mentioned on the Tombigbee. The other location is likely going to be at Kentucky Lock. The funding also is coming through this legislation. We've got our first little bit of money to move forward with making that transition from the current deterrent that's in place at Barkley, and then as more funding comes from the federal level, work at those additional sites. So moving on to our control actions here in Kentucky, we have approached our control and removal of invasive carp through incentivizing commercial harvest. And we specifically have this master agreement and incentive program for Barkley and Kentucky reservoirs, where we pay commercial fishermen a set rate per pound to harvest those invasive carp from these waters. Now currently that rate is at a price of 15 cents per pound, And over the last 10 years, we've adaptively managed that rate based on funding levels and harvest efforts that are occurring in this area to mitigate the invasive carp impacts here in western Kentucky. We have been very fortunate that we have the funding level we do for these programs. So all of our carp programs here in Kentucky are 100% federally funded. And for the federal funding for this program alone, the last couple of years, we've been able to secure $1 million to help remove those fish from the system. We also have a contract fishing program on the Ohio River. So with the contract fishing program, we actually pay commercial fishermen a set rate per day to go out and harvest fish in waters of lower abundance in the invasion front on the Ohio River, where it wouldn't be feasible for those fishermen to be out and to be trying to target and harvest fish because of their lower abundance and their distance to sell those fish to processors. So as our commercial harvest has grown here in Kentucky, we've also seen several private businesses come in and start purchasing fish. And we really wouldn't be at the level of harvest and removal that we have in Kentucky now if it wasn't for these businesses that are coming in and purchasing fish as a way of disposing of the harvested fish without having them to go into landfills or other deposition areas. The value-added products that are represented from these companies include things such as fish oil, fish meal, and fertilizer, human consumption products that are sold here locally. We have pet food. They turn invasive carp into bait for lobster, crab, and crayfish fisheries out on the coast, as well as even making high-end leather from the skins of the fish that are used in fashion over in Europe. So there's just a whole lot of opportunities for this particular fish to be a resource locally for us, making lemonade out of lemons, if you will. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, we've been very involved throughout the invasion of invasive carp here. We have a dedicated staff that oversees our programs. We have regulations in place that helped us adaptively manage our programs and to minimize the negative impacts that carp and the removal strategies could have on our native species and our recreational folks. We also have a really good fleet of commercial fishers here locally. These folks are very innovative. They're taking and adapting mechanical and industrial techniques, implementing them in the smaller vessels, and then being able to access waters where they wouldn't be able to if they were using some of the larger style vessels that they use out in the ocean for the similar approaches to increase their harvest and reduce fatigue of the fishermen. Just you can kind of see here that they've implemented cranes and brailer systems for these massive hauls of silver carp primarily. So our commercial industry has grown quite a lot in a very short amount of time. In 2025, we had a little over 8.6 million pounds harvested statewide. That is a bit of a decrease from the previous few years. But our running total since 2013 has been over 83 million pounds of invasive carp harvested statewide. So what kind of trends are we observing with all this harvest? So we have two approaches to monitor a fisheries like this. One would be fisheries dependent, where we're monitoring some aspects of the commercial removal industry. And the other would be a fisheries independent approach. And so this right here is what we call an electrified dozer trawl. So in 2025, the fall, Tennessee and Kentucky, we began a joint standardized monitoring project utilizing this gear. It is similar to a traditional boat electrofishing setup. However, it combines boat electrofishing with a fixed netting system that allows us to access unique habitats and move at a faster rate than what a typical dip netter on the front of a boat could capture fish. In addition to a traditional catch per unit effort estimate, We can estimate the number of fish by volume of water because of the known size of this net. As I noted, this is a new monitoring approach that we just implemented last year, so we're creating a baseline for our invasive carp independent monitoring in the two systems. You can see here on the map of the area, Barkley, Kentucky, where we run samples in the fall of '25. So prior to Tennessee and Kentucky taking on this joint monitoring project, we partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct fisheries independent monitoring with a gear similar to this, but very large in comparison. It's called a papier net. It's about 10 times the size of these nets, 2 wings that go off either side of the boat. But we decided as 2 agencies to move to this approach to become a little more independent from the Fish and Wildlife Service and to take the monitoring component on our own agencies. But we can look at some of the trends that we did see from that papier monitoring in the reservoirs. So comparing 2019 catch rates from that papier net in Kentucky Reservoir to 2024, you can see there's a significant decrease in the number of fish that were being caught through that monitoring gear. And finally, circling back to our fisheries dependent monitoring, where we're looking at components of the removal programs. In Barkley, Kentucky reservoirs in particular, over 25% of our ride-alongs in 2025 ended up with no fish being caught. So those were days we would go out with commercial fishermen, they would scan, not find fish to set nets on. That rate has been increasing pretty steadily over the last 5 years. And so that is very positive for our management approach to reduce abundance and distribution, to see those kind of trends. In addition to that, we see an increasing average length and weight of silver carp in the reservoirs, which would indicate that that population is declining. There's more resources to go around, so the fish aren't competing as much with other fish. They're able to get larger and longer. In addition to that, we have aging population of silver carp, where we see no young of year fish, also indicating that this is acting as a sink population. There's no in-reservoir recruitment. And finally, through our krill surveys, in 24, the krill survey was conducted on Barkley Reservoir. 69% of those respondents perceived a decrease in carp abundance in Barkley Reservoir over the last 2 years. So to kind of tie all of this together, we have these multiple lines of evidence that are indicating that there is a downward trend in the population of invasive carp from Barkley and Kentucky reservoirs, which is aligning with our management goals.